Thank you, Valerie. So tonight our speakers are Andy Hope, who is the author of Architecture of Faith Milwaukee, an online study of the city's historic churches and synagogues. He received his BA from the University of Michigan and his master's from UWM School of Architecture and Urban Planning. He has worked in historic preservation all of his post-college years, first for the New York State Preservation Office in Albany, and then for the California Department of Transportation in Oakland and Sacramento. After 21 years working in compliance with the state and federal historic preservation laws for highway projects, he has returned to Milwaukee to research and write about local architectural history. He is currently working with Docomomo, Wisconsin on a chapter in the upcoming collection, Milwaukee Moderns, with William Wenzler's Midcentury churches. Eric Vogel is currently a scholar in residence in Taliesin Institute in Scottsdale, Arizona. He is a designer, educator, architectural historian, and former chair of the 3D Design Department of the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. He holds a degree in art history from Harvard University, a master's in architecture from Southern California Institute of Architecture, and is pursuing a mid-career PhD in the School of Architecture and Urban Planning at UW-Milwaukee. As board president of the Wisconsin chapter of Docomomo, Eric is editing a book on Milwaukee's 20th century architectural history titled Milwaukee Moderns. Concurrently, he is working with the Museum of Wisconsin Art on 2 new architecture and design-related exhibitions, Frank Lloyd Wright's early modern furniture, and the photographic work of mid-century Wisconsin architectural photographer Richard H. Bills. So let's all welcome Eric and Andy.
I might be biased, but the opportunity that you have tonight to look at the drawings that come from these archives is a little bit like going to the Sistine Chapel, seeing the ceiling, hearing a little bit about it on a tour, and then going into the back room and having them show you the original drawings. I don't know how to describe what we have here, but these drawing sets are masterpieces. I got involved in this research because of my interest in Michael Johnson, who drew many of the drawings. So I encourage you, take a little bit of time to stand at the tables while they page through and get a sense for the mastery of what a really great architectural drawing set looks like. Okay, without further ado, Docomomo pop quiz time. Yes. How many historic buildings are in this photograph? All right, so for those of you who think 1, raise your hand. Very good, okay. How many think 2? Raise your hand. Okay, 1, 2, okay, that's about 10 people. How many think 3? Okay, that's like 20 people. How many people think 4? All right, that's almost sneaking up. It's 3. So it tends to be the 50-year trailing. So sometimes the look of history might surprise you. So this is Bertram Goldberg's addition to St. Mary's Hospital from the early 70s. He's the same architect that did the Corncob buildings, Marina City in Chicago on the river. So a little bit about Docomomo. What does Docomomo stand for? I think they chose the name because if you use words like preservation society to millennials, the ears immediately switch off. So it's an acronym, Docomomo. You could even dance to it. The documentation and conservation of the modern movement. So we are in our 2nd year as a chapter here in Wisconsin. Our mission is to create a modern registry of buildings, to create lectures, exhibitions, tours. We want to foster a deeper understanding of the modernist heritage in Wisconsin. And we work to celebrate, advocate, and network on behalf of modern landmarks to ensure that they're preserved for the next generation. So this was our most recent tour. Some of you might have been on this tour or seen the booklet we did. Thanks to Scott Templeton again for just a masterful graphic design job on this. Scott's here tonight, so let's give him a little round of applause. He also did the banners in the exhibit that you came through at the entry. So this was a tour of 12 churches using Capitol Drive as what we call our divine line from east to west. And really the intent was to create specific on-site learning interactions for people, to get people into neighborhoods and into churches. And so we created this booklet that gave them both a history, on the left if you can see that, and a viewing guide. People seem to love it. It's also about cross-sectional experiences. So it's about, in an election year especially, taking people out of their comfort zone, out of their own neighborhoods, and moving them into neighborhoods where they might not be comfortable, even though they should be, introducing them to different people. And we think it was really successful. We also have happy hour. It's Milwaukee, after all. We like to say, at random, happy hour, where the definition of what's modern changes every hour. Okay, so our project's in the works. So here's Dave Erickson, who's with us today. Let's all give Dave a round of applause for working the video, for all the work he's done. Here he is with some very delicate, large-scale John Randall McDonald drawings at MATC with Andrea Clooney-Perella using the Phase 1 camera, which you hook up and shoot vertically. It's amazing the technology and what it can do to preserve these artifacts. It's the same kind of scanning that the library and the archives does here. And then, of course, we work to conserve period photographs because you really don't know the subtleties of these interiors or these buildings, which have changed so much over the decades unless you can find original photography from the time period. So we've recently come across a cache of these photographs. It's the other exhibition that I'm working on with the Museum of Modern Art from the Richard H. Bills collection. We found a cache of about 8,000 artifacts in the basement of his son in West Bend. And we're working through that, inventorying, scanning, and we'll have an exhibition within the next 3 years, hopefully. So we do essays for online magazines. This is for Docomomo-US. We did an article about monumental modernist mosaics in Milwaukee, including the War Memorial, the State Office Building. We've done HAB drawings for the first registered black architect in Wisconsin, Alonzo Robinson. We're working on workshops to scan. We get the UWM students involved so that we can do three-dimensional scans and build models of the buildings. And we're hoping to do an exhibit about Alonzo's work in the next few years. We're here tonight because, and I want to thank my co-researcher, co-writer, co-speaker this evening, Andy Hope. He must be the hardest working Docomomo member, volunteer of all, and his work is exceptional. I want to thank him both for his website and what he's contributed to Docomomo. So I'm poaching on his research in a way. He agreed to write the chapter on these three churches. I said, I want to write on those churches. And so we've been doing work back and forth about Wenzler. I'm writing a chapter about the Nickel House on Lake Drive, which some of you might know. Andy's been focusing on the churches. We've been intersecting and looking at these drawings for about 6 months, and it's been a pleasure to work with him. So you see the beginnings of our research on those banners, and you'll get a lot more in depth tonight. So special thank yous to our new partners. The Milwaukee Public Library, AIA Wisconsin did just a fantastic job with the Eventbrite site. We're so glad to have them as new partners. If you need your credits, don't forget to sign that sheet before you leave. The Wisconsin Architectural Archive, I'm a huge fan. Thank you to Valerie and Bob and Kirsten and Joan and everyone at the library for allowing us to do this. It's been a fantastic success, and we're so glad to see so many people here tonight. At first, when everyone walked in, I thought, do they think John Gerda is speaking? I mean, it's just Andy and I talking about hyperbolic paraboloid churches. Hope everyone's good with that. And I want to mention again Scott Templeton. Deborah Wenzler Ferris is here with Todd, her husband. I don't know if can she stand up? I don't want to embarrass her too much. Oh, she's right here in the front. So she wrote the book called Conversations with Dad. So she did many oral interviews with her father, which became Conversations with Dad. Without that book and without the family moving all of the drawings to the archive, none of this would be possible. It is magisterial. Thank you so much for doing that work. Yeah. And Seth, who is playing the supporting actor role tonight. You don't know that yet, but you'll find out in a second. Yeah, coming soon. And to the three churches and their congregations that opened their doors to us and let us poke around in the basement and said, are there any original drawings here? And took all of our questions. They were great. So let's thank everybody who was involved. So tonight is a reminder that we all need to be proactive in saving the spaces that are most important to us. We need architecture that builds us up, that inspires us, that reminds us of powers that are larger than our lives, relationships with physical things and people. And it doesn't mean they have to be big. It doesn't have to be Niagara Falls or the Empire State Building. It doesn't have to be the Milwaukee Art Museum Calatrava edition. It can be a bird's nest. It can be a gemstone. It could be an important historical marker or a homestead. It could be the church down the block. These buildings are reminders of our larger humanity and our ambitions, our aspirations, our creativity. I would say there's a kind of humble monumentality that's about aspiration and about intention, and I think it's embodied in these churches. I think it's an expression of our particular human ability to inspire one another. I would say that here aspiration maybe even has an angle of divine intent. I think that was certainly William Wenzler's feeling. These churches were the result of 4 young men. The first 2 churches were done before anyone in the office was 30 years old. Think about that for a second. Nobody was 30. Wenzler was 27 when he went to Mexico to talk about hyperbolic paraboloids with Candela. He'd only been out of school for 5 years. So what's remarkable is that their aspirations were at the highest level of what they saw as not just national architecture, but a global architecture. And I would say that they were going after things that we would call unknowable. They were after what Lucan would call the immeasurables. So it's something that most of us deal with in terms of faith, but it could be whatever your particular practice is, whatever your contemplative life is. Wenzler was an extremely religious man his whole life. He was born in Milwaukee. He grew up here, was born in 1929. He received his architectural degree from the University of Illinois in Champaign. There was no architecture program in Wisconsin at that time, so you chose from Michigan or Illinois or Minnesota. He was torn in his early life from becoming a pastor or becoming an architect. And I think he saw that as a dilemma at first, but it's really a false dilemma, because I think from the very earliest times he knew that he would be an architect of churches. And that influence went right through college. It's interesting to note. So he refers in his interviews to Professor Morgan in particular, who taught concrete structures. He loved that class. And as he said, this was before the age of calculators and computers, so all my calculations were done by slide rule. But what's interesting is that what he remembers about Professor Morgan most wasn't a particular case study on a concrete thin-shelled structure. It was how at the end of every semester, Professor Morgan would give an optional week of lectures in which he talked about the meaning of life, often having to do with Christ, the Bible, and his belief. But it was all set up with charts and graphs and calculations. So William Wenzler married Dolores Rahn, Bill and Dee, in 1950 when they were still both students. They honeymooned in northern Wisconsin, but their second honeymoon was really the important one. They drove to California on a mission with their local church to design a new church in Reseda, California. He was only 23 years old. He wasn't licensed in California. He found a local architect to do the working drawings and to do construction observation. He was intent that he was going to build right out of school. So after returning from California, he worked for Al Seward, who was one of the most prodigious church architects in Milwaukee at the time. That didn't last long. He went to Brust and Brust. He was 24 years old, working at one of the largest firms, and he was given an entire church project that had failed after 10 attempts with a pastor, 10 different concept designs. They said, "Bill, we want to put you on this, see what you can do." His first designs were accepted by the same pastor. They gave him the whole job. He did everything through details and construction drawings at 24. So it's not surprising that between 1952 when he graduated and 1955 when he started his own firm, he did 8 churches. I mean, he did residences, he did other buildings, he did an elementary school. St. Edmunds, you'll see, which we're going to profile, is at the bottom there. So these started in 55, 56. So you can see that his intent, his comfort zone, was always in the design of churches, and mostly modern. I mean, when you're 25 and you're starting your own firm, you take all the jobs that you can get. So there are some traditional churches, which are funny, but his contemporary churches are, even at this stage, masterful. So there's a turning point that's really essential for everyone to understand, and I wanted to use some of Deb's interviews. His conversations with Deb really give us the story, the detailed story of how he became interested in the hyperbolic paraboloid geometry and how that took shape in the commission of St. Edmunds. So I'd like to invite William Wenzler to give us his feelings about that.
This is my Halloween costume. I'm William Wenzler. All right. It says, I was selected as the architect and eventually designed a very nice but typical contemporary church for them, using laminated arches and beams. The St. Edmunds Building Committee reviewed the design as it developed and approved it. After the committee meeting, they had a coffee.
Can you use the microphone?
Yeah, absolutely. After the committee meeting, they had a coffee and cake gathering in the fellowship hall of their existing building. I got into some discussion on architectural history. I explained about Gothic architecture with its incredible structural systems and sculpted forms. I explained that the two facets, art and structure, were totally integrated into one unit, that the buildings were always the most advanced structural scheme known to man. Some of the committee asked me how I would make an expression merging structure and faith today, as it was done in the Gothic period. I'm not sure, I said, but I've been reading about thin shell concrete, where large structural spans can be developed based on the shape of the form instead of its mass. Can we have something out of thin shell concrete, the committee asked. I really don't know enough about it, I responded. I'd have to do some reading to look into it and get back to you. So they all agreed to put my very nice but rather typical contemporary design aside until I could find an engineer that was familiar with thin shell concrete. I started to learn as much as I could myself. I learned about the shape that was designed by Mexican architect Felix Candela. It was doubly curved and known as a hyperbolic paraboloid. The name came from the section through the shape. In one direction gives a pair of hyperbola, and in another direction a parabola. Al Parm, who had been working on this very thing, showed me work he had been doing on a theory with hyperbolic paraboloids. He said that it hadn't been tested, yet he was sure that he was right, so I asked him if he knew of an engineer that could talk with to apply his theory. He asked me, what's your background? I graduated in an architectural engineering program at the University of Illinois, I said. That's great, he said. You do it. I'll help you. So I reported all this back to the committee at St. Edmunds, explained how experimental it was, but shared the confidence that I had in Al Parm and the Portland Cement Association. The committee voted to cancel their previous approval and instructed me to proceed with investigating a design with a thin shell concrete roof.
Nice work. Oscar worthy.
Yes.
Oscar worthy. So I want to go back to just a second. I want to show you some of the things that showed up. So these are all sketches from 1956. So these all come right from Bill Wenzler's desk. And it's fascinating. Even here, he's just starting to play. Here's an elevation of the church. So as you saw in the very first drawings, he's created kind of a Wrightian design. Do people recognize that from the Unitarian Church in Madison? There's a Harry Olrogi church on Sherman Boulevard that we had on the Divine Line tour that was very much like this roof. This is a classic copper Wrightian roof, and this little cupola the same. So it's not derivative. He's working in his own vein, but he thinks it's typical. Just in these sketches, he's trying to work out, here's a hyperbolic paraboloid, here's a dome. The spandrels use hyperbolic paraboloids, as we'll talk about. So he's trying to think about what expression works best for this particular application. Here you can see the side elevation. Here's the hyperbolic paraboloid. Just brief sketch and its buttress. Here's the elevation that you'll see later. And here's the contemporary design that they voted to hold. So you can see he's really trying to figure out, these are the laminated beams that he's talking about. So he's already got a roof structure, he's got an idea, but he's clearly not happy with the way the roof is developing, and he's got this on his mind. Okay. Are there any structural engineers here? Because we're two art historians. I mean, we really, can someone do it some justice, or should I keep going? All right, I'll give it a shot. So the hyperbolic paraboloid comes from two different basic shapes. They're derived from sections of a cone. So here you can see a cone, and it's sliced across the center to make a circle that everyone can understand. It's sliced at an angle to create an ellipse. In the same way, a parabola is sliced at an angle through the base. A hyperbola is sliced perpendicular, orthogonally, through the base. Those two shapes are what combined to create this saddle shape. The roof of St. Edmunds is effectively the saddle shape, but it's created by a square. And yes, it's a Pringle, in case you didn't notice, or a hypar for short. So the typical definition is hyperbolic paraboloids, also called hypars, are usually thin concrete slabs. They don't have to be concrete, as you'll find out, in curved shapes, but are sometimes built of wood. Hypars are typically four-sided, with parabolic curves along the axis between opposite corners. The curves are concave in one direction and convex in another. That's the key. So here's the hyperbola in one direction, and here's the parabola in the other. And the oppositional forces are extremely steady, saddle point, compression in one direction, tension in the other. Hypar roofs, because of this stability, because of this unification of these two geometric shapes, can span very large areas with extremely thin dimensions, sometimes only a few inches, sometimes only 2 to 2.5 inches. So here's Wenzler working out the shape of the hyperbolic paraboloid for St. Edmunds. The church ends up on the cover of Reinforced Concrete magazine. That has got to be like the achievement for a 27-year-old. What could be better than the cover of Reinforced Concrete magazine? You can see he's really driven in detail. This is not, once he achieves the shape, you can see here, he's commenting. It says, sight line's not good, tip too high, looks small. So he's working on a budget. The thing about hyperbolic paraboloids is they use so little material, they're extremely efficient. Once you build the forms, they're actually cheaper. So in terms of budget, it's an advantage to use this level of geometry. Not if you're doing it for the first time, but in general. So what's happening here is he's really working with the building committee to achieve something that even on a small scale has a certain feeling of monumentality. He's very aware of architectural history. He knows where thin-shelled concrete structures come from. This, of course, is the Pantheon. For those of you who've been there, you know that it's a remarkable structure. The span is extremely wide, over 90 feet. The walls are sometimes 20 feet in thickness at the edges, and at the very oculus, it's less than 24 inches in depth. So the Romans were able to develop thin-shelled concrete because of a variety of circumstances. They had somehow an understanding of the specific types of sand that they would use, so they would mine the sand from Naples. It was called the Pozzolana sand. It had a particular chemical bond in its molecules that was extremely strong that allowed it to span with very little thickness. They had volcanic stone that was extremely light that they could use for their aggregate. We had this technology until the fall of Rome, basically until the 6th century, when it died until the 19th century, the very end of the 19th century. The reason that masons were so popular in medieval times is because we lost the ability to pour concrete. The Romans knew how to pour hydraulic concrete in the water. their harbors, it's set underwater. Their understanding, all of the viaducts, their mortars, their waterproof mortars is exceptional. We didn't get the use of concrete back until the end of the 19th century, and there's some debate about whether that happened in France or whether it happened in England. But the beginning of the 20th century is when we start to see poured concrete again. Anybody know one of the first great poured concrete buildings in the country? It's pretty close, only 90 miles away. Come on, architects. Frank Lloyd Wright's Unity Temple in Oak Park. We also have a very early poured concrete structure in Lake Park, the Ravine Bridge, which uses a special con engineering system developed in Detroit just before the First World War. So it's just hard to imagine that this achievement of the Romans was rediscovered and absolutely fresh at the First World War. Hyperbolic paraboloids were used in Gothic times. We're not sure if they knew the geometry, but the spandrels, so this diagram here, the spandrel action, these curved spandrels actually act like curved surfaces as hyperbolic paraboloids rather than as flat plane triangles or parallelograms. And they can bear unusually heavy loads with no deflection, remaining stable. So the history in the 20th century of the modern thin-shelled concrete building begins really with Anton Tedesco. There are four major influences in the United States, or really in North America, I shouldn't say the United States. Tedesco, who comes to the United States and does the largest and most important early structure. He does Hayden Planetarium in New York City, some of you might know, it's still there, which was a sphere. The Hershey Sports Arena in Hershey, Pennsylvania was the first large span, thin-shelled concrete dome. Pierluigi Nervi, who does fantastic buildings in Italy before and after the Second World War using ferrocemento. He comes to the United States in 1970, does the Norfolk, Virginia Scope Arena, which is a remarkable building based on the Palazzetto dello Sport that he does for the 1960 Olympics in Rome, which we'll see in a second. Eduardo Torroja, is that right? Torroja builds this fantastic hyperbolic paraboloid in Caracas, Venezuela in 1957. But Torroja is most well known as an educator in Spain, and Felix Candela is one of his great students who emigrates at the time of the Spanish Civil War to Mexico in 1939 and achieves great fame, becomes known as the shell builder. What's remarkable is that Wenzler really considers himself a global architect. He goes to visit Nervi personally on his fellowship in Rome. And he goes to the office, he walks up to the office unannounced, is invited in, there's someone who speaks English, they get a tour of the office, then they go the next day to tour the unfinished Palazzo dello Sport, which you can see here. Keep these columns in mind. We'll see them something similar when we talk about our Shepherd Lutheran. Here's Nervi at the Colosseum. Wenzler was particularly impressed by this tile system that sat on top of the forms. It was a unitized system. He loved the fact touring the office that Nervi seemed to do his own calculations and drawings, even at that stage of fame. So here's Candela. Candela is the preeminent designer of thin-shelled concrete and hyperbolic paraboloids for the second half of the 20th century. And Wenzler was first introduced to his work in a progressive architecture article featured in the July 1955 edition. You can see the article here. And his great church in Mexico City. His name really became synonymous with hyperbolic paraboloids. He was often the architect, the structural engineer, and the contractor, because everybody else said, "You're absolutely crazy. It'll never work." And he said, "I'll show you it'll work." And this is what he went on to do. So his first hyperbolic paraboloid was the Cosmic Rays Laboratory at the University of Mexico in Mexico City. But he went on to design Hyparus for 2 decades. Look at these. and even applied to more pedestrian functions like warehouses. So we know that Wenzler traveled to Mexico to speak with Candela because he was pretty sure that his calculations were right, but Candela had built. He had proven that the hyperbolic paraboloid was a stable form. And so he went to Mexico City and to Candela's office, and they spoke, and Candela pointed out that based on his experience looking at Wenzler's drawing, that there needed to be more buttressing along the bottom edge of the building. And that really bothered Wenzler. You can see all of those sketches that have basically the floating form of the parabola with the only two remaining buttresses. They're 6 feet elevated off the ground, human body scale. He really wanted the roof to feel like it was light, but relate to the human body. He didn't want buttressing all along the edge. That bothered him. He stayed 2 days to work through the calculations and then flew home.
Hello, everybody. There's going to be a little bit of overlap between the three of us. But where's the...
In my hand. Did you want it?
Thank you. Over the course of his career, Wenzler designed at least 20 churches, all for Protestant denominations. Most of these were in Wisconsin, with 2 in Illinois and one that was mentioned in California. He was also commissioned by Protestant denominations for at least 15 other projects, including the remodeling of older churches, classroom additions, and parsonages, as well as libraries and classroom additions for Protestant seminaries. And this data comes from the list of drawings in the Wisconsin Architectural Archive. A substantial majority of Wenzler's churches were designed early in his career in the 1950s and early 1960s. And from the later 60s and beyond, his work shifted somewhat away from church commissions toward more housing and commercial projects. With his degree in architectural engineering at the beginning of his career, as Eric elaborated a bit, he had a strong interest in exploring innovative structural methods for his churches. From the mid-50s to the early 1960s, he designed 4 churches incorporating thin shell concrete components. 3 of these were in the form of hyperbolic paraboloids. The one in the upper right is thin shell concrete, but it's not hyperbolic form. One of the things that initially stimulated Wenzler's interest in hyperbolic paraboloids was a house in Raleigh, North Carolina, designed by the architect Eduardo Catalano. Catalano was from Argentina, but was living in North Carolina and teaching at North Carolina State University when he designed this house. Built in 1953, the house had a wooden roof in the form of a hyperbolic paraboloid, supported on just 2 opposite corners. The roof was just 2.5 inches thick, with 3 layers of wood nailed together and topped with a plastic roofing. An article about the house was published in the August 1955 issue of House and Home magazine, shortly before Wenzler began designing churches with concrete hypar roofs. And this house is no longer standing. There we go. Wenzler's first church with a hypar roof was St. Edmund's Episcopal in the suburban community of Elm Grove. The church was designed in 1956 and construction was completed the following year. It was probably the first building in Wisconsin with a concrete hypar roof and one of the earliest in the United States. Its current name is Oxano Church. In order to develop the design for this church, as Eric mentioned, Wenzler traveled to Mexico City to consult with Felix Candela. In reviewing Wenzler's proposed design, Candela expressed some concern about whether it included adequate support for the concrete roof at its 2 lower sides. He advocated for more substantial buttresses to resist the thrust of the curved roof form. Wenzler then consulted with Al Parham in Chicago, who Seth had mentioned, who at the time was the head of advanced engineering for the Portland Cement Association. Parham assisted in the design of concrete structures, including bridges, dams, and tunnels, in addition to buildings. He was a member of the technical staff of the Portland Cement Association from 1940 to 1968, where he produced technical publications and developed analytical and design procedures for concrete structures, including thin-shell concrete roofs and hyperbolic paraboloids. Parham stated that the Hypar roof was a self-supporting freestanding form with internal thrusts remaining within the form, and that more substantial buttresses were therefore not needed. Parham also suggested making a concrete model of the Hypar roof with instrumentation to monitor the stress and deflection. The photo shown here is an example of a model being tested, but it's clearly not the model for St. Edmunds Episcopal. It's a different Hypar roof. Testing the model of St. Edmunds indicated that the design was structurally sound. Wenzler sent copies of the final design to Candela, who responded, quote, "I won't say it will fail, but if it stands, it will be a coincidence." The photo on the left shows the final design of the Hypar roof, and on the upper right is the formwork built to create the concrete Hypar. And on the lower right, it shows the completed roof. The concrete roof is just 3 inches thick with a grid pattern of wire reinforcement rather than heavier steel rods. As you can see, it's thicker along the edges, has a little more steel reinforcement to provide more strength and stability. The roof is 120 feet in length from front to back, 86 feet in width, and rises to 42 feet above the ground at the front of the church. On the east and west sides, the roof extends down to about 6 feet above the ground, where it's supported on each side by concrete buttresses on the outside of the building. The buttresses on each side are connected underground by a concrete beam with steel reinforcement to resist any spreading force from the weight of the roof. The perimeter walls of the church are of wood construction and do not support the roof. The roof is only supported by those concrete buttresses on each side. Speaking of his distinctive modern design, shortly after the opening of the church, Wenzler stated that new churches, quote, should not be a shadow of the past, but an expression of the future. In 1958, Wenzler received a traveling fellowship from the University of Illinois, which paid for a 6-month trip to Europe. Wenzler applied for the fellowship as an opportunity to study European church architecture. He went to Europe with his wife and 3 young children.
Is that Deb in the tub right there in the bottom right? Is that you?
Ed and John.
Okay.
I'm not in the tub.
You're not there yet. Okay. You're in Mom's arms.
And the family traveled extensively around the continent for those 6 months. And they camped out quite a bit of the time they were there to save money, as you can see in the left photo. Wenzler had, as Eric mentioned, had a particular appreciation for Gothic architecture because the structure of Gothic churches is clearly visible and clearly understandable, not hidden. And this was a characteristic that he wanted to employ in many of his own churches. Wenzler also attended the World's Fair in Brussels while he was in Europe in '58, where he was able to see numerous distinctive modern buildings. Among these was the Philips Pavilion, designed by the Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier, shown in the photo at right. The building is comprised of 9 concrete Hypars of different sizes and shapes, which may have further stimulated Wenzler's interest in using Hypars. Hyperbolic, it's a shortened term for hyperbolic paraboloid. In 1957, Wenzler was commissioned to design a new church for Zion Evangelical and Reformed congregation. The church, designed prior to Wenzler's trip to Europe and completed in 1959, It's located at South 76th Street and Ohio Avenue in the southwestern portion of the city. A few years after its completion, the name was changed to Zion United Church of Christ due to the merger of the evangelical and reformed denomination with the congregational denomination, forming the United Church of Christ. Like St. Edmund's Episcopal, Zion Church incorporates thin shell concrete in the form of hyperbolic paraboloids, but in a different and unusual manner. The exterior includes 6 hypars that together form the east and west walls of the church and portions of the roof, as well as 4 smaller hypars that form the remaining portions of the roof. The 6 wall panels are identical in size and shape, with each having a concave curve between the side corners and a convex curve from bottom to top as the panels curve to reach the center of the roof. Each panel is 20 feet in width at its widest point, where the side corners meet, and 33 feet in height. The concrete is just 3 inches thick, with wire reinforcement. The 6 hypar wall panels were precast, set into place, and bolted together. Precasting the panels allowed for simpler and cheaper construction without the need for the extensive formwork that would have been necessary to cast the entire structure into place as a single unit, as we saw with St. Edmund's. The 4 hypar roof panels have relatively shallow concrete concave curves along the front to rear axis of the building, and similarly shallow convex curves along the side-to-side axis of each panel. Each roof panel is 20 feet in length along the front to rear axis and 32 feet in width from side to side. Like the wall panels, the 4 roof panels were intended to be precast and then set into place and bolted to the wall panels. However, the building contractor decided to cast each panel in place after the wall panels had been set up and bolted together. An elastic vinyl coating was sprayed onto the exterior surfaces of all 10 of the hypar panels. Between the hypar wall panels are triangular voids that extend from the ground to the roof. Within each of these voids are concrete forms consisting of a pattern of vertical and angled components which divide the area into smaller triangles. The triangular open areas within each of these panels are filled with stained glass. These concrete forms, all with the same pattern of vertical and angled components, were also precast and bolted to the hypar wall panels. And here's the interior of the church, and you can see the curved surfaces of the wall and roof hypars from the inside. The stained glass windows were designed by Peter Recker of Conrad Schmidt Studios of West Milwaukee, now located in New Berlin. Founded in 1889, Conrad Schmidt Studios is still in operation, and for more than a century has been designing and installing stained glass, mosaics, murals, sculptures, and other decorative materials for buildings, with much of their business focused on churches. The altar, pulpit, and lectern at the north end of the worship space are all made of stone and were designed by Carl Giel. Giel made a career of designing sanctuary furnishings, crosses, and other decorative objects for churches. He also designed and produced chalices and wedding rings. He collaborated with William Wenzler more than any other architect and designed some furnishings and decorative features for Wenzler's residential and other commissions, in addition to his churches. The altar at Zion Church, shown at left, consists of a single piece of stone, 8 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and 40 inches high. Because it weighs several tons, it was set in place on its own foundation prior to the construction of the church. Giel also designed the decorative screen behind the altar. It's 14 feet wide, 23 feet in height, and made of precast concrete blocks. All of the blocks are the same complex design, but are arranged in different ways to create a more varied decorative pattern. Wenzler's third church using concrete hypars is Our Shepherd Lutheran, located in suburban Greendale. It was completed in 1963. The roof of the original portion of the building consists of 4 separate hypars of 3 different sizes, separated by narrow glass skylights. The skylights meet at the highest point of the roof, 40 feet above the floor and directly above the altar. They form the shape of a cross, which casts a dynamic and symbolic light on the floor. Shown here are some of the conceptual sketches of the design drawn by William Wenzler to consider alternatives and work towards a final conception of the design. The building code for the village of Greendale required that concrete slabs be at least 5.5 inches thick, which was thicker than originally proposed for the hypars. Wenzler's office reached a compromise with the building department that the slabs would be 4.5 inches thick. As at St. Edmunds and Zion, the hypars are also enlarged along the edges. In developing the hypar roof design for this building, Michael Johnson, who at that time was the lead draftsman in Wenzler's office, went to Mexico to consult with Felix Candela. As with the design for St. Edmunds Episcopal, Candela expressed some concerns about the design, including the thickness of the hypars and whether the weight of the roof would be adequately supported. Wenzler consulted again with Al Parm in developing the final design for the roof and buttresses. As with St. Edmunds Episcopal, Parm suggested building and testing a scale model. Rather than concrete, the model was made of acrylic resin and was about 4 feet in width and 6 feet in length. And this obviously isn't the model here, but it's an example of testing a model of a hypar. The photo shown here, okay, it shows holes drilled into the model, and strings are attached to the top of the model and lowered down through the holes. And then lead weights are attached to the bottoms of the strings to add weight to the model and in potentially numerous different arrangements. The test for Our Shepherd Lutheran model indicated that the design was stronger than anticipated. The development of the final design, which evolved from Wenzler's initial sketches, was a collaborative effort by Wenzler, Michael Johnson, and structural engineer David Brandt, who was working in Wenzler's office at the time. The drawings are by Michael Johnson, who was masterful in producing very technical drawings. The hypars are supported by concrete buttresses that slope upward from the ground to the roof. Each of the 4 hypars is supported on opposite corners, with the 8 buttresses paired at each of the 4 locations to form a V shape. As originally built, the church had a diamond shape in plan. There's the plan. With the worship space about 92 feet from side to side and 62 feet from front to back. This wide, shallow space allows the congregation to sit closer to the altar and pulpit, in contrast to the deep, narrow worship spaces more common in older churches. There have been some changes to the worship space since the original construction of the church. The curved chancel platform, the large altar, and the curved wall at the rear of the chancel are later replacements of the original design and furnishings. In addition, the current seats are later replacements but conform to the original seating layout. And the ceiling clearly shows the pattern of board formwork used to cast the concrete hypars. And here we can see the 2 photos to the left are part of the original building. The 2 to the right are a later addition, which I'm going to talk about more in just a moment. And you can see how the ones on the left, the original ones, the board formwork is clearly visible, whereas the formwork for the later buttresses was made of plywood sheets, giving the concrete surface a smoother appearance. The perimeter walls are of wood with glass between the wood studs on the upper portions of the walls. All of the glass is clear rather than stained glass. Some of the wood studs are slanted rather than vertical, as you can see. And this results in slanted rather than strictly rectangular sheets of glass, window frames, and in some cases even doors that have slanted rather than vertical sides. It appears that Wenzler's motivation for this was just to create more visual complexity in his design. A substantial addition to the east side of the church was constructed in 1992, designed by the firm of Wellman Architects. The addition is also diamond-shaped in plan, of comparable size to the original building, but with a flat roof. The addition allowed for enlargement of the worship space by moving some of the other functions of the original building to the addition. The second addition, outlined in red here, was also designed by Wellman Architects and built in the year 2000. It's a canopy at the main entrance on the east side of the building, extending from the 1992 addition. And the addition spans over the front driveway and is topped by a roof in the shape that matches that of the original building, supported by sloping buttresses that also match those of the original building. It is a distinctive example of a building addition that so closely matches the original building that it appears to be part of the original design, but what is in fact actually designed and built 3.5 decades later. And we're back to Eric.
Michael Johnson is still brash. He's 86 years old. He smokes Lucky Strike unfiltered cigarettes, and he starts drinking scotch at 2:30 in the afternoon. So he's been like that his whole life. I mention that because when they were building the model at the Portland Cement Association in Chicago, Michael was there. And according to Michael, and it's substantiated in the interviews, it definitely was an acrylic resin model. Michael gave us the exact size. Bill Wenzler corroborates that Michael was there in the room. According to Michael, he said to Al Parham, "What do you guys do with all these models?" And Al Parham said, "Oh, well, I'm very sorry to say there's no way we can keep this for you. I mean, if we kept every model we made, we'd have storage absolutely full." And so Michael said, "So we could load it up?" And Al Parham said, "Well, sure." And so Michael looked around the room, and there was a concrete block to the side that, according to Michael, weighed 32 pounds. So he put a concrete block on top of the acrylic resin model, and it held. And then he looked at Al Parham and he said, "Can I do one more?" And Al Parham said, "Whatever you want to do." So he took another concrete block and put 64 pounds on the roof of the model, and it held. And then Michael got a glint in his eye, took the concrete blocks off, and Al Parham thought he was just going to keep the model and take it home. He saw a 90-pound cement bag over on the side of the room, and he put it on the model, and the whole thing completely collapsed. So about, I don't know, someone can do the calculations, but about 3 times the weight was supported. So an interesting thing happened in the 1960s. There was a convention, the World Council of Churches met in New Delhi in India, and Wenzler, who was a deeply religious man his entire life, he didn't attend the conference, but he knew architects who did, and he read their statements and was deeply affected by the conference. From this point on in his career, he really began to see the church not as a structure, as a building, but as a congregation of people and the good works that they could do. So he thought that money spent on building meant less money spent on ministry and evangelism. There was a Wisconsin Council of Churches the year after where William Wenzler got into deep debates with other architects about this idea of where limited budgets should be spent. It came to a kind of head. His son and grandson were involved in the firm by then, and Bill was still going to interviews for churches with them, and Ed took him aside and said, "Dad, a job interview is not the time to tell the client that they shouldn't spend their money on a new building." So things change in the office. The world is changing. The 70s, the late 60s and 70s shift to sustainability. There's an energy crisis. Budgets are much lower. Things change. The work becomes much more eclectic. You can see this is a group of buildings after 1965. I don't want to say that there was a considered attempt to shift from his earlier work, but his internal values changed as the world changed. I'll just read you William Wenzler's own words. "After 55 years, I've done some reflecting. When I graduated from college, I thought I would design worship spaces that would help bring people to Jesus. St. Edmund's congregation has moved on, and the building's for sale. Currently, there are church ministries worshiping in remodeled warehouses all over, and they're very effective. The conclusion I've reached, therefore, is that it's not about architecture. In the end, I realized that it can never be architecture that draws people to Jesus. It's only the Word of God. And yet, after many moves, some months empty, sometimes difficult sales, untested congregations, and new denominations, these churches are full. People of faith are still drawn to these buildings to worship. They stand, they look great, you should visit." So when we think about these buildings, of course we've been talking about the measurable, we've been talking about the rational, we've been talking about the facts, the dimensions, the processes. But for centuries, since Gothic times, philosophers, mathematicians, theologians have been fascinated by the symbolism of the hyperbolic paraboloid. So these are just a couple of the terms that they apply to hypars. So as we talked about, because of the sweeping lines, they see them as infinite and eternal, resilient and adaptable because of their ability to combine bending and stress and remain stable, divine and cosmic. These are subjective, but they're applicable. So N.J. Solomon has written about the symbolism of the hypars. In many spiritual traditions, the symmetry and balance of the hyperbolic paraboloid, it has one axis but no center of symmetry. Its dual nature, both concave and convex, as well as its ability to distribute forces evenly over its surface, have been interpreted as symbols of interconnectedness and interdependence. Some have also seen the hyperbolic paraboloid as a symbol of duality of human nature, with its opposing curves representing the balance between light and darkness, good and evil, and the material and the spiritual. So the hypar forms, the voids of the triangles, is clearly a duality that's being expressed in this design. And I want to point out the intention to express Gothic elements in modern technological means. So here are the two hypars. So this is the hypar here. It's one form, as Andy mentioned. It's tipped into place. So here's the side view, the section. It's tipped into place and bolted to the top. So that's the point right here. Between the hypars is a cast-in-place roof that secures the whole membrane. But when you tip the hypars, what do you get on the inside? A perfect Gothic arch, a pointed Gothic arch. So this is our shepherd, a section. Think of the complexity of this drawing. So here's the hypar. You can see the thickened frame at the edge all the way along. This is showing the hypar from an angle and showing the thickness of the frame in section. It's difficult enough to draw the hypar, much less to show the hypar in section and get the dimensions right. What's fascinating, and few people know, I have not seen material evidence to this effect, but I want to pass on because it's a great story. Donald Grebe won a competition or a series of interviews to do the domes. He came up with this extremely complex dome design. It was going to be cast in place in concrete. He had never done a large-scale concrete building like that. He didn't know how to draw it, a conoidal dome. He could build a model of it, but he didn't know how to draw and dimension and calc it. So what did he do? He went to Wenzler's office, and he said, I need help. I can't do the calcs if I can't draw this. So Michael Johnson figured out how to dimension drawings for the domes, and then Wenzler and Grebe did the initial calculations so that Grebe could be confident that he could take his designs to the domes, to the county, and to his engineers, and they would be viable. So that gives you an idea for the level of confidence that people had in Wenzler's office when it came to concrete buildings. But I want to talk to you about things that we found in the drawings here that astound me. And it's about the heart within the man. It's about the symbolism in his sketches. So this is what the sketches look like when you unfold these drawings here at the archive. So they're all layered on top of one another. And this is classic trace drawings. You know, it's very thin paper that architects use so they can see the different layers. They can work with a plan, make changes while seeing their initial version, then do version on version on version. So here Wenzler's already got an idea for these hypar roofs and the skylights that rest between and their position over the altar. So there's ministry going on here. There's also a tremendous amount. Here are the hypars. So this is after Zion. Here are the hypars of Zion. There are all these different shapes for the roof. He's trying to figure out how most effectively and symbolically to design the roof. This is a big beam section. So he's thinking about the shape and the thickness of the beams. He's also drawing or writing text. So in Wenzler's words, so that we don't think that we're being speculative or too subjective, what does he say about the aspirations and symbols and values of these buildings? He says in his own handwriting, life is a seeking of balances, logic, faith, present, future, intellect, emotion, reason, impulse, equated through love shown by Christ. So he's using poetic, psychological, and religious terms as a kind of design language that utilize specific structural features and techniques. And those are here. Shells as columns, he means hypars. Shells as columns, shells as walls, corrugated, segments, plates as columns. And here they are graphically. So he clearly intends to manifest his intentions about spiritual practice through structural expression. But his intentions were also cultural and political, including many, many, many roof designs for our Shepherd Lutheran that would symbolize a systemic equality and freedom of expression through technology. All the different ways of unitizing the roof. Does he break it up into a series of squares or small squares? Here you can see the influence of Nervi's Palazzetto dello Sport, thinking of how to unitize the system of the roof. Here is much more aligned with what we see today with the 4 sections, but notice they're all even sections. He ended up doing 4 differently shaped sections. Why does this matter? Because this is what he's writing on the same page as his drawings. Volumes and spaces reflect interrelationships and all of life, exclamation point. The architecture of democracy, exclamation point. Freedom, exclamation point. reflect technological culture, exclamation point. So in ending, in the final analysis, why don't we look at these incredible architectural photographs and let the buildings speak for themselves. I'd call that aspiration. I thought back to that critical building committee meeting where I talked about architectural history, especially Gothic, which was an expression of the Christian faith of their day. We sought to accomplish that for our day. William P. Wenzler, Fellow, American Institute of Architects. I know some of you have been to these buildings. I know some of you have Wenzler stories. So if you want to share them or ask any questions, we have a few minutes. Yes, you know who I'm looking at. Michael, please, Bob, ask your question.
When they make those forms, are they like out of a plywood form? In other words, like the roof on St. Edmunds. I guess I'm just surprised that they can, that huge of a span strong enough that it structurally comes together. What kind of concrete is that? Because it's not the stuff that chips in my driveway.
I'll try to repeat that. So what are the forms that they use to make these hyperbolic paraboloid roofs? Are they made out of sheets? And is it the same cement that I use in my driveway? I don't know what cement you use in your driveway, but it's not a particularly unusual cement. They could vary it if the curing is at a particularly cold time or season. There are additives they can use, but it's not the cement, it's the shape. So it's not the mass, it's the shape that allows it to be so thin. And the reinforcement is just a thin wire mesh. The forms that they make, the thing about a hyperbolic paraboloid, which is so astounding, it's that it's made by straight line generators. So I don't know if you remember the photograph of St. Edmunds, and there was one worker walking along that curved surface, and Andy pointed out that there were forms. Those thin pieces of wood, that's all straight wood. The wood is not bent. They're straight lines. That's one of the nature of this. That's what makes it less expensive. So the forms, you have to build the forms, but they're no more expensive than a normal form. In fact, they're sometimes simpler because all the elements are straight. We didn't have a chance to talk about it tonight, but he designed a very interesting and beautiful church in Random Lake called St. John's. You can call, make an appointment, and go and visit. It's more rustic. It's a fieldstone church. There's some debate about it, whether it's a high-power roof. It's certainly an iterative roof. It both curves and rises at the same time, but it's a more classic post and beam construction. So you can see the wood joists, the straight wood joists that form the curved high par. Michael Johnson assures us that it's at high par. Andy and I we want to talk to a structural engineer about that first. In any case, one of the qualities that we should have said is that a high par is generated by straight lines. I know someone who, Michael.
I was talking to Eric earlier, and I mentioned I grew up in Menominee Falls, about 10 miles north of St. Edmunds. And I distinctly remember, especially when Brookfield Square opened, and there was more reason to go that way, we would often go by St. Edmunds, and it always knocked me out every time I went by it. And it still does. I mean, it's a remarkable building, and certainly the most remarkable building on the drive between Menominee Falls and Brookfield. And probably a much larger area. So it made a huge impression on me. And then it occurred to me after we talked, Eric, that not that many years later, the Catholic church in my grandmother's hometown, Menominee, Wisconsin, was demolished and replaced with a modern church, 1965, with a high par roof, which was something that I was then experiencing when we would go visit. It was actually under the high par roof, which is even better.
And that's in Madison?
It's in Menominee.
In Menominee, okay.
Menominee, Wisconsin, up north.
Okay. Thank you. Wonderful. Any other questions? Yeah, Sabina.
What is the, does it have a weak link? What kind of fail eventually with these hyperbolics? Or do they have a superpower because during earthquakes?
They have a superpower if they're made of concrete. That first hyperbolic paraboloid house that you saw by Catalano, who came from Argentina, it was so thin, there was basically no insulation. There's no joist. There's nothing turned on an edge to give depth to the structure. Again, it's the shape that gives the strength. So it was just boards nailed together. And that thin plastic membrane failed over time. The membranes, the caulks, the things in between are always what fail, right? And then the water gets in. And the third owner of the house didn't keep up with it, and the water got in and rotted the wood, and it failed and collapsed, and is no longer with us, which is really a shame because, as you saw, it was a spectacular house. There are many other hyperbolic paraboloid houses. They actually, I would say that probably, I'm fascinated to know there's another Hypar church in the state of Wisconsin. Michael, you and I have to go visit because it's much more typical to find Hypar houses, many of them on the East Coast because, like Catalano, they were coming out of the GSD with Marcel Breuer, who was there teaching with Gropius, and they were so excited about poured concrete. So a lot of these, both massive structures, so Breuer is known for his massive concrete pours, and Catalano became fascinated by the thin-shelled Hypar. And so he taught at North Carolina. In Durham, there's a fantastic stadium that has, they call it a quasi-hyperbolic paraboloid roof. It's close but has some additional buttressing, which purists feel isn't necessary. So what we have in these Wenzler churches is absolutely pure hyperbolic paraboloid structures. They're in great shape. You might not like the color of the interior of the church, but it's remarkable. So the Zion Church with the colorful stained glass, that is a brand new, it's a Hmong community organization. They rent the church out. You can rent the fellowship hall, but they care for that building. All of Carl Giel's interiors, the pulpit, the altar, the pews, those are all original. Nothing has changed. They're in terrific shape. So I would say, is the building functioning? Yes. Is it necessary to keep up the membrane on the outside of those Hypars? Yes. If you go to Zion, you can see that there's a little water penetration, there's some bubbling. And so that congregation, which is young, I would not say they have deep pockets, I don't know, but that's my observation, that they're going to have to face a time where they're going to have that membrane replaced. And that's probably in 5 years, not 10 or 20 years. So can they do that? Part of the reason that Andy and I wanted to talk about these buildings tonight was because the churches are in decline. Most churches are in decline. So the Divine Line tour, we saw no young congregations. Now, interestingly enough, Oxano Church, which is in St. Edmunds, is a young, professional, family-oriented congregation. That's the only one that I've seen. Otherwise, it's actually the Hmong community at Zion is also young. I take that back. Our shepherd is stable, but many of the churches that we've seen, the congregations are dwindling. So as we went across Capitol Drive, you would be amazed. You'd see a church that could hold 200 people, and there would be 30, and no one was younger than 60 years of age. So I think one of the challenges we're going to have in preservation is what do we do with churches? How do we repurpose them in a meaningful way? When I was in college, and then I'll end. I was in college, I went to see a gunned adaptive reuse of a church in the Back Bay, and I have to say it was difficult. Because in the space of the altar, with the glass, in the church nave, was the master bedroom. So we've got to figure it out. I mean, it's not, I would say there's a terrific church in Brookfield, I don't know the name of it, that has offices on an elevated platform. So if you know Zimmerman Design that's in the Menominee Valley, they've done a great reuse of one of the old factory buildings. I think you could add a floor, as they did in the Menominee Valley, to a large enough church. We're going to have to get comfortable with the idea that these sacred spaces are going to have secular uses if we want to keep them intact. And if we do it in an educated, smart way, we can remove all of these things if we return to a more sacred culture and there's demand for more churches. John?
Is this going on all over the country also?
Yeah. I think it's pretty well understood that the young demographic is not going to church. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned insulation, so clearly St. Edmunds has no insulation on that roof. How is it to maintain the energy in that building?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. One of the things that people don't like about the new roof, because they just redid it, is that they added insulation. So it's starting to change the profile at the edge. These are extremely lean buildings, just as the domes is lean. So that's another challenge as we look to the future, is how can you incorporate thermal protection for the interiors and keep in mind some energy efficiency. It's difficult. You have to find ways to add insulation. I've heard that some people are doing it on the inside. They're trying to find creative ways, thinner insulation. You know, there's no, every case study is unique. My hope is that we can start to give this talk to the congregations themselves, that we can say, if you're interested in your building or you'd like to get together as a group of congregations, the three the Hypar churches of Wenzler, if you'd like to see this talk, they don't know what they have. They don't know the architectural significance or the interior significance of the things that they have. Carl Giel's work in these churches belongs in the Museum of Wisconsin Art. His craft, I don't know if you could see the Christ figure, it was sort of draped within the white cloth in Zion. It's absolutely stunning. His woodwork, his sculpture, his rings, his chalices, all of that's a level of craft that's rarely seen. It belongs in a museum. These churches really don't know how to value it. They appreciate it. But so what happens to these contents, and what happens when we have to deal with exorbitant heating costs? I mean, I think, as you know, fortunately, the technology of our equipment is getting much better. So we're hoping that if we can begin to have conversations and win the trust of the congregations, then maybe we can put together panel discussions with experts in preservation who could help them. We can make suggestions to them. Hey, you need to fix your roof. Have you thought about how to insulate it? Would you like to talk to someone? Would you like us to put a discussion panel together to help you with some of those decisions? That's the ultimate goal. I mean, we'd love to reach out to bids and politicians and try to save the buildings that don't have stable owners, but that's a longer term goal. Right now it's to make friends with the owners, help them understand what they have, and then try to connect them with real experts that can answer some of those tough questions for them. Yeah.
In conclusion, could you describe the Divine Line self-guided tour that you've arranged for the churches along Capitol Drive?
Sure. So as I alluded to, we put together a tour of 12 mid-century churches that starts at Kingo Lutheran in Shorewood on Wilson Drive and goes west all the way to Brookfield. It actually ends not at a church, but at a mausoleum at the Wisconsin Memorial Park. They are extraordinary buildings. There are significant black churches tied to the civil rights era. There are significant Catholic, Lutheran. We have a perfectly intact Donald Grebe Church. We have to, we move up to Silver Spring. We take a little leap off of Capitol Drive to get there, but it's fascinating. So they have a vibrant community. They have services in Vietnamese. They have African language and German language services at this church. So oftentimes the churches will have they'll rent to younger congregations. So they'll rotate 3 or 4 different churches through one structure. The important thing about the Divine Line Tour is that we were able to create a book that you can use at any time. So if you want to go after a Sunday service or you want to go to a service at the church, you can take your book. There's a history of the church. There's what's significant to see on the inside. We're going to have those available on the Docomomo, Wisconsin website. It's docomomo-wi.org. So you can take that tour at any time. We will do follow-up tours in the coming months when I'm back from Arizona next summer. And we'd like to do another cross-sectional tour through the south side. And someone on the Docomomo board said, no, don't go east-west. We have to do a north-south tour. So it's the cross. It's not the Divine Line, it's the Divine Cross. So we have lots of plans. Look out for those things. But we do have to go, because I want you to have time with the drawings, and then we have to be out by 8 o'clock. So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.